In 1941, the Empire of Japan seemed invincible. Its navy was the most powerful in the Pacific. Its soldiers were conquering Asia with terrifying speed. But the empire had a secret weakness. A glass jaw that its own admirals refused to acknowledge. Japan was an island nation with almost no natural resources. To build its Zeros, it needed aluminum from Malaya. To fuel its battleships, it needed oil from the Dutch East Indies. To feed its people, it needed rice from Indochina. The entire war effort depended on a constant, uninterrupted flow of merchant ships, the Marus, shuttling back and forth across thousands of miles of ocean. If that flow stopped, the empire would starve. It would run out of gas. It would cease to function. The Japanese High Command, blinded by the samurai spirit and the doctrine of the decisive battle, ignored this reality. They viewed war as a clash of warriors. Battleships fighting battleships. They viewed merchant shipping as unglamorous logistics, unworthy of a warrior's attention. Consequently, they essentially refused to organize convoys. They didn't build escort destroyers. They didn't develop sonar or anti-submarine weapons. They sent their precious cargo ships out alone, unprotected, believing that the vastness of the Pacific Ocean was protection enough. They also looked at the United States Navy's submarine force and laughed. Japanese intelligence reported that American submarines were few in number, technologically inferior, and commanded by cautious men who treated their boats like delicate instruments rather than weapons. They believed the Americans lacked that spiritual power to endure the claustrophobic terror of submarine warfare. They were partially right. In 1941, the U.S. submarine force was weak. It was hamstrung by bad doctrine and bad leaders. But the Japanese made a fatal error. They assumed the Americans would stay weak. They didn't realize that by leaving their merchant fleet unprotected, they were offering the United States a way to bypass their mighty battleships and strike directly at the throat of the empire. They were creating a target-rich environment for a predator that was just waking up. The Japanese admirals were playing chess, protecting their king. They didn't notice that the Americans were about to start playing poker with the economy that kept the king alive. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they ignored the submarine base. They bombed the battleships, but they left the fuel tanks and the submarine piers intact. Admiral Nimitz, surveying the destruction, realized that for the moment, the submarine force was the only weapon he had left to take the offensive. He issued a dramatic order: execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. This meant sinking everything. Warships, tankers, rice freighters. No warnings. It was a violation of pre-war treaties, but after the sneak attack, the rules were thrown out. The U.S. submarines deployed to the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies to stop the Japanese invasion. And they failed miserably. The U.S. Asiatic Fleet submarines were mostly old S-boats, rusty veterans of World War I without air conditioning, and a few newer fleet boats. But the problem wasn't just the age of the boats, it was the mindset of the captains. The pre-war U.S. Navy was a peacetime organization. Submarine captains were promoted for having clean ships, accurate paperwork, and not taking risks. They were trained to be cautious. Don't scratch the paint. They were taught to attack only using sonar, from deep underwater, to avoid detection. When the Japanese invasion fleets arrived in the Philippines, appearing as massive, slow-moving targets, the American captains froze. They stayed too deep. They fired from too far away. They were terrified of the Japanese destroyers. Japanese transports landed troops on the beaches of Luzon almost unopposed. The Japanese officers on the decks of the transports laughed. They had expected a fight. Instead, they saw nothing. The few American captains who did try to attack found themselves let down by their equipment. They would fire a spread of torpedoes, wait for the explosion, and hear nothing. The Japanese ships sailed on, unharmed. The morale of the U.S. submarine crews plummeted. They risked their lives to get into position, endured depth charge attacks, and had nothing to show for it. The Japanese dismissed the American submarine threat as a paper tiger. They believed the Americans were simply incompetent sailors. They became even more complacent, sailing their ships with lights on at night, fully convinced they had nothing to fear from the depths. But the failure wasn't just about the captains. It was about a scandal that was brewing in the torpedo factories back home. The Mark 14 steam torpedo was supposed to be the most advanced weapon in the U.S. arsenal. It cost $10,000 apiece, a fortune in 1941. It was developed in total secrecy. It had a magnetic exploder, the Mark 6, that was designed to detect the magnetic field of a ship and detonate underneath the hull. This would break the ship's keel, sinking even a battleship with one hit. It was a wonder weapon. But there was one problem: it had never been tested with a live warhead. The Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, in Washington was arrogant. They trusted their calculations. They refused to waste money on live-fire tests. When the war started, the Mark 14 was revealed to be a dud. Actually, it was worse than a dud. It was a triple failure. First, it ran too deep. A captain would set the depth for 10 feet to hit a cruiser. The torpedo would run at 25 feet, passing harmlessly under the target. The captains complained. The Bureau in Washington blamed the captains. "You are calculating the data wrong," they said. Second, the magnetic exploder didn't work. The magnetic fields near the equator were different from those in New England where the device was designed. The torpedoes would explode prematurely, 50 yards from the ship, alerting the enemy but doing no damage. Or they wouldn't explode at all. Third, and most heartbreaking, was the contact exploder. If a brave captain managed to disable the magnetic exploder and hit a ship square in the side for a contact kill, the firing pin would jam. The impact at a perfect 90-degree angle was too hard. The mechanism crushed itself before it could fire the charge. This led to tragic scenes. The submarine USS Tinosa found a massive 19,000-ton Japanese whale factory ship, the Tonan Maroon No. 3, floating dead in the water. It was a sitting duck. The target of a lifetime. The Tinosa fired 15 torpedoes. The crew listened. Clang! 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 They saw the splashes as the torpedoes hit the hull. Not one exploded. They sailed back to Pearl Harbor with one torpedo left, heartbroken and furious. The Japanese captains who survived these attacks thought they were charmed. They thought the Americans were firing logs at them. They didn't realize they were surviving only because of bureaucratic incompetence in Washington, D.C. The Great Torpedo Scandal saved the Japanese Empire for nearly 2 years. It allowed Japan to consolidate its conquests while the U.S. Navy fought a war against its own defective weapons. The turning point came in the form of a man, Rear Admiral Charles "Uncle Charlie" Lockwood. He took command of the Pacific submarine force and immediately changed the culture. Lockwood was not a desk admiral. He was a sailor's sailor. He listened to the angry captains returning from patrol with their stories of duds. He didn't blame them. He believed them. He declared war on the Bureau of Ordnance. When the Bureau claimed the torpedoes ran true, Lockwood ran his own tests in Australia. He fired torpedoes through fishing nets to see where they cut the holes. The nets proved the torpedoes were running 11 feet deeper than set. He sent the evidence to Washington. "Fix it," he demanded. When the magnetic exploders failed, he ordered his crews to disable them. When the contact exploders failed, he authorized his machinists to redesign the firing pins using metal from downed Japanese planes. Lockwood fixed the weapon. But he also fixed the men. He began to weed out the peacetime captains. He looked for a new breed. He didn't want careful administrators. He wanted killers. He found men like Mush Morton and Dicker Kane. He gave them a new standing order. The old doctrine said, "Sonar is your eyes. Stay deep. Be safe." Lockwood said, "Get off your ass. Surface. Use the periscope. Use the deck gun. Pursue." He encouraged aggressive tactics. He told them that the submarine was not a defensive scout, it was an offensive raider. He improved the food. He secured ice cream machines for the boats. He made sure the crews were treated like royalty when they returned from patrol. He built a culture of elite aggression. By 1943, the problems with the Mark 14 were mostly solved. The new Gato-class submarines were arriving in numbers. They were air-conditioned, long-ranged, and heavily armed. And the men commanding them were no longer the hesitant novices of 1941. They were angry. They were frustrated by 2 years of failure. And they were looking for payback. The Japanese admirals, still laughing at the paper tiger, didn't notice the change. They didn't realize that the tiger had just sharpened its claws. And it was hungry. By late 1942, the S-boats, the cramped, rusting iron coffins that had struggled in the Philippines, were being replaced. Emerging from the shipyards of Groton and Mare Island came a new breed of predator. The Gato-class submarine. This was the machine that would win the war. To the Japanese, who were used to their own cramped submarines or the small American S-boats, the Gato was a leviathan. It was 311 feet long. It displaced 1,500 tons. But its most important feature wasn't its size, it was its endurance. The Gato was designed for the vastness of the Pacific. It could cruise for 11,000 miles without refueling. It could stay on patrol for 75 days. It carried 24 torpedoes, almost double the load of earlier boats. Inside, it was a revolution in livability. It had air conditioning. This might sound like a luxury, but in the tropical heat of the South Pacific, where internal temperatures in S-boats hit 120 degrees, air conditioning kept the crew fresh. It kept the electronics from shorting out. It turned the submarine from a sweatbox into a high-tech command center. and it was packed with technology the Japanese couldn't match. The most lethal addition was the SJ radar. Japanese lookouts were famous for their night vision. They relied on highly trained men with binoculars to spot enemy periscopes. But the SJ radar allowed the American subs to see in the pitch black. They could spot a Japanese convoy 10 miles away at night, plot its course, race ahead on the surface to set up an ambush, and fire torpedoes without ever seeing the target visually. The Japanese captains couldn't understand it. They would be sailing on a dark, moonless night, completely silent. Suddenly, a torpedo would slam into their side. They thought the Americans had supernatural luck. They didn't know they were being tracked by invisible beams of microwave energy. The Gator was also tough. Its pressure hull was welded, not riveted. It could dive to 300 feet officially, but captains routinely took it deeper to escape depth charges. It could take a beating that would crush a lesser boat. As these new submarines flooded into Pearl Harbor and Australia, the balance of power shifted. The Japanese had mocked the weak American boats. Now, they were facing a fleet of long-range, radar-equipped assassins that could hunt them anywhere, anytime, in any weather. The Gato didn't just patrol, it dominated. If the Gato class was the weapon, Commander Dudley Mush Morton was the man who showed the Navy how to use it. In early 1943, Morton took command of the USS Wahoo. He was the embodiment of Admiral Lockwood's new philosophy. He didn't want to survive, he wanted to kill. Before his first patrol, he gave a speech to his crew. "The only thing I want to see in the periscope is the ass end of a sinking Jap ship." Morton threw out the rulebook. The standard doctrine said the periscope was the primary tool. Morton used it sparingly. He preferred to rely on his own eyes or the radar. He revolutionized the role of the executive officer, XO. Traditionally, the captain manned the periscope and did the math in his head. Morton put his XO, Dick Kane, who would later become a legendary ace himself, on the periscope. Morton stood back, looking at the plot, visualizing the entire battle in his head, shouting orders. This split the workload and made the Wahoo fight faster than any other boat. On January 26, 1943, the Wahoo spotted a Japanese convoy. Instead of firing from long range, Morton drove right into the middle of it. He engaged a Japanese destroyer, the Hiroshima. The destroyer turned to ram. Standard procedure was to dive deep and hide. Morton didn't dive. He ordered, "Down the throat." He fired a torpedo directly at the bow of the onrushing destroyer. It was a game of chicken. A 1,500-ton submarine versus a charging warship. The torpedo hit. The destroyer's bow was blown off. Morton then systematically hunted down the rest of the convoy. He sank ship after ship. He didn't stop until his torpedo racks were empty. When the Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor, it had a broom lashed to its periscope, the symbol of a clean sweep. The news of Morton's exploits electrified the submarine force. He proved that the Japanese destroyers, the boogeymen of the ocean, could be killed. He proved that aggression saved lives. Other captains began to emulate him. The Morton method spread. The Japanese admirals, reading the reports of the Wahoo's rampage, were disturbed. This wasn't the timid American Navy of 1942. This was something new. Something reckless, violent, and terrifyingly effective. Morton didn't just sink ships, he sank the Japanese belief that they owned the ocean. By 1943, the U.S. Navy intelligence had decoded the Japanese merchant codes, the Maru Code. They knew exactly where the ships were. And Admiral Lockwood made a strategic decision that would strangle the empire. He ordered his captains to prioritize one specific target: tankers. Oil was the lifeblood of Japan. It powered the battleships, the Zeros, and the factories. Almost all of it came from the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, and had to be shipped north to Japan. It was a long, thin jugular vein. Lockwood told his skippers, "If you see a battleship and a tanker, sink the tanker." The Japanese tankers were big, slow, and flammable. Hitting one with a torpedo was a spectacular event. The volatile crude oil or refined aviation gas would ignite instantly. The explosion would be visible for 30 miles. The heat would be so intense it would blister the paint on the submarine's periscope. The ocean would turn into a lake of fire. The loss of these ships was catastrophic for Japan. A tanker takes a long time to build. It requires specialized pumps and piping. Japan didn't have the shipyard capacity to replace them. As the number of tankers dropped, the effects rippled through the entire war effort. In Japan, civilians were told to turn off their lights to save power. Charcoal-burning buses replaced gas-powered ones. But the military impact was fatal. The Imperial Navy, the pride of the nation, was grounded. Battleships like the Yamato spent months anchored in port because they guzzled too much fuel to move. Pilot training was cut. New pilots got only a few hours of flight time because there was no aviation gas to spare. This created a death spiral. Poorly trained pilots couldn't protect the convoys, leading to more sunk tankers, leading to even less fuel. The U.S. submarine captains called it the T-Tanker War. It wasn't glamorous. Shooting a merchant ship didn't earn as many medals as sinking a carrier. But it was the most effective blockade in history. The Japanese officers who had mocked the American cowboys were now watching their own war machine grind to a halt, rusted and dry. They were losing the war not on the battlefield, but at the gas pump. For the Japanese merchant sailor, the war became a descent into hell. In 1941, they were the unsung heroes of the expansion, carrying the spoils of victory. By 1943, they were hunted animals. Crewing a Maru merchant ship was a death sentence. The survival rate for Japanese merchant crews was lower than for kamikaze pilots. They had no sonar. They had no radar. They often had no escort. They would be sailing in the South China Sea, the water calm and blue. Suddenly, a white streak would appear in the water. There was no time to turn. No time to scream. The torpedo would hit. Because Japanese damage control was poor and the ships were overloaded, they often sank in minutes. Thousands of sailors went into the water. But the horror didn't end there. The Japanese Navy, obsessed with warrior values, often refused to pick up survivors from merchant ships. They believed it was more important to continue the mission than to stop for civilians. Or, they were too terrified that the submarine was still lurking nearby. So, the sailors were left to drown, or be eaten by sharks, or die of thirst on rafts. The psychological toll was immense. Sailors refused to board ships. Mutinies occurred. The Japanese government had to draft crews, forcing them onto the ships at gunpoint. They knew that the ocean was full of American eyes. They knew that the ocean was full of American eyes. The wolf packs were closing in. Unlike the German wolf packs, which were coordinated from shore, the American wolf packs, coordinated attack groups, were led by the senior commander on the scene. 3 or 4 submarines would coordinate via short-range radio. One would attack from the front, scattering the convoy. The others would wait on the flanks, picking off the fleeing ships. It was a massacre. The Japanese captains of the Marus felt a crushing sense of helplessness. They were sailing in tin cans filled with explosives, across an ocean owned by an invisible enemy. They knew that the Americans were listening to their radios. They knew they were being watched from the periscopes. The arrogance of 1941 was replaced by a fatalistic terror. They were just waiting for the torpedo with their name on it. And the Americans, with their improved torpedoes, their radar, and their ruthless new captains, were more than happy to deliver it. By 1944, the individual hunter-killer submarine had evolved into a coordinated team. Inspired by the German U-boat tactics in the Atlantic, Admiral Lockwood developed his own version of the wolf pack. The Americans called them coordinated attack groups. The German packs were directed by radio from headquarters in France. The American packs were directed on the scene by the senior captain, the pack leader. This made them faster and more flexible. A pack usually consisted of 3 or 4 Gato or Belau-class submarines. They hunted together, communicating with short-range radios to avoid Japanese detection. The tactics were devastating. The pack leader would spot a convoy on radar. He would then coordinate the attack. One submarine would attack the convoy's escorts, the destroyers. This would draw them away. The other 2 submarines would then attack the merchant ships from opposite sides. The Japanese convoy commanders were overwhelmed. Torpedoes were coming from everywhere. Ships were exploding on the port side. Ships were exploding on the starboard side. The escorts were chasing ghosts, their sonar confused by the multiple contacts. One famous wolf pack, known as Blair's Blasters, led by Commander Leon Blair, went on a rampage in the Luzon Strait. In a single patrol, they sank over 100,000 tons of Japanese shipping. The Japanese convoys, already poorly protected, were slaughtered. The wolf packs allowed the Americans to attack larger, more heavily defended convoys that a single submarine might avoid. They turned the South China Sea into an American lake. The Japanese admirals who had once mocked the American submarine effort now found their entire defensive strategy unraveling. They were being bled white by an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't stop. The wolf pack was the ultimate expression of the new American submarine philosophy: aggressive, coordinated, and ruthless. It was a assembly line of destruction, dismantling the Japanese empire ship by ship. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of the submarine war was felt in every corner of the Japanese empire. The lifeline was severed. The statistics were staggering. In 1941, Japan had 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By the end of 1944, the U.S. submarines had sunk nearly 5 million tons of it. The flow of raw materials to Japan had effectively ceased. The home islands were starving. rice imports from Southeast Asia stopped. The Japanese government cut food rations drastically. People in Tokyo were supplementing their diets with sawdust and acorns. The industrial machine ground to a halt. Factories that built Zero fighters and tanks shut down because they had no aluminum, no rubber, and no steel. But the most critical shortage was oil. The Japanese Navy, once the master of the Pacific, was paralyzed. Before the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, the Japanese fleet had to split up based not on strategy, but on where the fuel was. The battleships were in Singapore, near the last remaining oil sources, while the carriers were in Japan to get their new planes. When they sailed into battle, many ships had enough fuel for a one-way trip. They knew they couldn't come back. This desperation contributed to the rise of the kamikaze tactics. If you don't have enough fuel to train a pilot to return to a carrier, you teach him how to crash into a ship. The U.S. submarine blockade was so effective that by 1945, American submarines were running out of targets. Captains would cruise for weeks without seeing a single Japanese flag. They began to attack fishing boats and sampans with deck guns, just to find something to sink. The Japanese admirals, who had dreamed of a decisive battle between battleships, were watching their nation die a slow death by strangulation. They had ignored logistics, and logistics was now killing them. The empire that had expanded across half the globe was now cut off, isolated, and withering on the vine. While their primary mission was destruction, the U.S. submarine force took on another role that made them beloved by the rest of the military. They became the world's most dangerous lifeguards. As the air war against Japan intensified, hundreds of American pilots were shot down over the vast Pacific Ocean. Ditching in the ocean meant almost certain death from exposure, sharks, or capture by the Japanese, which often meant execution. Admiral Lockwood realized his submarines, already patrolling deep in enemy waters, were perfectly positioned to help. He organized the Lifeguard League. Before a major carrier strike or B-29 bombing raid, submarines were dispatched to lifeguard stations along the flight path. If a plane was hit, the pilot would ditch near a waiting submarine. The submarine would surface, often right under the noses of Japanese coastal batteries or patrol boats. The crew would scramble onto the deck, pull the wet, terrified aviator from his life raft, give him a shot of medicinals whiskey, and take him below. The sight of a black submarine periscope breaking the water was the most beautiful thing a downed pilot could see. One submarine, the USS Tang, commanded by the legendary Dick Kane, rescued 22 naval aviators in a single patrol, packing them into the already cramped boat. Another sub rescued a young Navy pilot named George H.W. Bush, the future president. This mission had a huge impact on morale. Pilots knew that if they went down, that silent service was looking out for them. It was a testament to the versatility of the submarine. The same machine that was ruthlessly sinking Japanese tankers was also risking everything to save a single American life. It showed a humanity amidst the brutality, a brotherhood between the men who fought in the air and the men who fought beneath the sea. And it drove the Japanese crazy. They would see American planes being plucked from the water right off their coast, another humiliation delivered by the force they had once dismissed. When the war ended on August 15, 1945, the U.S. Navy had become the largest and most powerful fleet in history. Its aircraft carriers and battleships got the glory. They were the stars of the newsreels. But the statistics tell a different story. The U.S. submarine service was tiny. It comprised less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel. Yet, this 2% was responsible for sinking 55% of all Japanese ships lost during the war. They sank 1,178 merchant ships, over 5 million tons. 214 warships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and 11 cruisers. They had completely destroyed the Japanese merchant marine. They had starved the home islands into submission before the atomic bombs were dropped, and before a land invasion was necessary. The Japanese post-war Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, admitted that the destruction of the merchant fleet was one of the 3 main reasons for Japan's defeat. But the price of this victory was horrifying. The submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any American service branch. 52 submarines were lost. Over 3,500 submariners, nearly 22% of the force, went out on patrol and never came back. They are still on eternal patrol, entombed in their iron boats at the bottom of the Pacific. The story of the U.S. submarine war is a story of transformation. It is the story of how a force of rusty boats, defective weapons, and timid captains was forged in the fire of war into the most lethal maritime killing machine ever created. The Japanese admirals mocked them. They ignored the threat. And because of their arrogance, their empire was strangled. The victory of the submarines was not won in a single glorious battle. It was a war of attrition, fought in the cold, dark depths of the ocean, one torpedo at a time. It was a silent victory. But its echo destroyed an empire.